There's something deeply comforting about words. The right words can make us feel safe, understood, even valued. And that's exactly why they can also be misleading, because words on their own require very little risk. They don't demand consistency, and they certainly don't demand integrity. Anyone can learn the language of loyalty, empathy, or commitment, but not everyone is willing or able to live it. This is where we often get it wrong. We give too much weight to what people say and not enough attention to what they consistently do. We assume that intention and behavior are aligned, when in reality they often are not. And when there's a gap between the two, that gap is not neutral. It tells you something important about character. Brené Brown often talks about trust as something that's built in very small moments. It's not formed in declarations or promises. It's formed in the quiet, often unnoticed choices people make every day. Do they follow through? Do they show up when it's inconvenient? Do they act with the same integrity when no one is watching? Because here's the truth: consistency is not accidental. It is a reflection of values in action. When someone repeatedly says they care, but disappears when you need them most, that's not confusion. That's information. When someone promises change, but their behavior remains the same, that's not a misunderstanding, that's a pattern. And patterns are incredibly difficult to argue with because they don't rely on interpretation. They reveal reality. Psychologically, we resist seeing this clearly. There's a concept known as cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when reality doesn't match our beliefs. So instead of adjusting our perception of the person, we adjust our interpretation of their behavior. We rationalize, we minimize, we tell ourselves they didn't mean it, or they're just going through something. And while empathy is important, it should never come at the cost of clarity, because the longer we ignore behavioral patterns, the more we train ourselves to distrust our own judgment. And this is where it becomes not just about them, but about us. When we consistently choose to believe words over actions, we're not just misreading someone else's character, we're abandoning our own sense of truth. We start negotiating with what we know. We start lowering our standards in subtle, almost invisible ways. And over time, that erosion becomes significant. Philosophically, character is not something people declare, it's something they demonstrate. It's not an abstract idea, it's a lived reality. Aristotle described character as the result of repeated actions. In other words, who you are is what you consistently do, not what you intend to do, not what you promise to do, but what you actually do. So when you're trying to understand someone's character, don't listen for the most compelling story. Look for the most consistent pattern. Do they respect your boundaries, or only acknowledge them when it's convenient? Do they take responsibility, or do they deflect when things go wrong? Do their actions create stability, or do they create confusion? Because confusion, more often than not, is not a lack of information, it's a lack of alignment. And here's the difficult part: seeing this clearly often requires letting go of who we hoped someone would be. It requires grieving the version of them that exists in our expectations but not in reality. That's not easy. In fact, it can be incredibly uncomfortable, but it's also necessary, because when you anchor your trust in words alone, you're building on something unstable. Words can shift, promises can change, but patterns tell the truth over time. And once you start paying attention to those patterns, something shifts internally. You become less reactive to what people say and more grounded in what they do. You stop chasing reassurance and you start recognizing evidence. You stop asking, what did they mean? And you start asking, what are they showing me? That shift is powerful because it moves you out of confusion and into clarity. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is always more protective than illusion. At the end of the day, people reveal who they are, not in isolated moments, but in repeated behavior. And the real question is not whether the signs are there. The real question is whether you're willing to see them. Because once you do, you have a choice: continue believing the story or start trusting the pattern. If you stay with the patterns long enough, another truth begins to surface, and it's often even more revealing than inconsistency. It's how a person responds when something goes wrong, not when things are easy, not when everything is working in their favor, but in those moments where there's tension, failure, or harm. Because this is where character is tested, and more importantly, where it becomes visible. Accountability is one of the clearest indicators of emotional maturity. And yet, it's also one of the most avoided. To take responsibility for your actions requires a willingness to feel discomfort, to sit with guilt, to face your own limitations, to admit that you caused harm. That's not easy. In fact, most people are psychologically wired to protect themselves from that kind of discomfort. So what happens instead? Deflection. You'll see it in subtle ways at first. A missed commitment turns into an excuse. A hurtful comment becomes "you misunderstood me." A repeated behavior is minimized, reframed, or redirected. And over time, a pattern emerges not just of mistakes, but of avoidance. And avoidance is never neutral. It tells you that the person is more committed to protecting their image than confronting the truth. Brené Brown often speaks about vulnerability as the foundation of courage, and accountability is a form of vulnerability. It's the ability to say, without defense, "I was wrong," or "I hurt you," or "I need to do better." That kind of honesty requires strength, not surface-level confidence, but real, grounded courage. When that's missing, something else takes its place: blame. Blame is a powerful defense mechanism. It allows people to shift responsibility outward, to maintain a sense of control, and to avoid the internal work that growth requires. But the cost of that avoidance is significant, because when someone cannot take responsibility, they also cannot change. Growth and accountability are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. This is where many people get stuck in cycles that feel confusing and exhausting. They keep hoping that the person will eventually understand, eventually take ownership, eventually change. But hope without evidence can become a trap. It keeps you invested in potential, while reality continues to repeat itself. Psychologically, this dynamic can even begin to distort your perception. When someone consistently avoids accountability, they often reshape the narrative in ways that make you question your own experience. This isn't always intentional manipulation. It can simply be their way of preserving their self-image, but the impact is the same. You start second-guessing yourself. You start wondering if you're overreacting. You start carrying responsibility that isn't yours to carry. And that's where the real damage happens, because the absence of accountability doesn't just affect behavior. It affects trust. Not just trust in them, but trust in your own judgment. And once that begins to erode, it becomes much harder to make clear, grounded decisions. From a philosophical perspective, accountability is deeply tied to integrity. Integrity is not about being perfect, it's about being whole. It's about alignment between what you believe, what you say, and what you do. And when a mistake disrupts that alignment, accountability is what restores it. It's the mechanism through which a person returns to their values. Without it, there is no return, only repetition. So when you're evaluating someone's character, don't focus only on whether they make mistakes. Everyone does. The more important question is, what do they do next? Do they lean in or do they pull away? Do they own it or do they redirect it? Do they repair or do they repeat? Because over time, those responses form a pattern, and that pattern will tell you whether you're in a relationship that can evolve or one that will remain stuck. It's also important to recognize that accountability is not something you can force in another person. You can communicate, you can set boundaries, you can express how their actions affect you, but you cannot make them take responsibility. That choice has to come from them, and if it doesn't, that's not a gap in your communication. It's a limitation in their willingness, and this is where clarity becomes essential. Not harshness, not judgment, but clarity. The ability to see the pattern without distorting it, without minimizing it, and without overcompensating for it. Because when someone repeatedly refuses accountability, they are showing you the limits of the relationship. Not the potential, not the possibility, but the limit. And once you see that limit clearly, you're faced with a decision. You can continue investing in the hope that something will change, or you can begin adjusting your expectations to match reality. Neither choice is easy, but only one of them is grounded in truth. At the end of the day, accountability is not just about admitting fault. It's about creating the conditions for trust, growth, and respect. Without it, even the strongest connection will eventually weaken under the weight of unresolved patterns. And the question you're left with is simple, but not always comfortable. Are you holding on to who they could be, or are you responding to who they've consistently shown themselves to be?